happy to be here with you too, finally, as you said, because it's been a long time coming. And I think as a field, yes, it's also sort of, we have been, or all the corpus linguistics approaches to the study of heritage languages has been a long time coming. And I'm so happy to be finally here speaking about this and speaking about not just from the point of view of here's a call for action, but actually we do have some research, and more research is coming out in this field, which is all very, very exciting. I apologize for a very lengthy title of my presentation, but I wanted to be very specific to, give everyone a heads up about what exactly I'm going to be speaking about. What I would hope to cover today is to talk about corpus linguistics methods in the study of learner language varieties, and I decided to sort of include L2 and heritage language varieties today into the same talk for a couple of different reasons. Because I do think that, well, first of all, we're learning a lot from learner corpus research when we are attempting to do our study of heritage language from the perspective of corpus-based research. But also, we are looking at, so we're sort of thinking about the complexity of learner languages. I think it's really good for us to consider these multiple aspects of the diversity in language learning, in learner language in general. I'm also talking about understanding learner varieties from this methodological perspective of using semi-automated and automated measures of linguistic complexity in order to gain some insight into the development, the gains, and the proficiency levels. And specifically, I will be reviewing my work that I have done with L2 and HL learners of Russian. Russian is the language that I mostly focus in as of right now, at least, although I do hope to expand my research into other heritage languages as well. So what I hope to cover today is to talk very briefly about the key constructs, to very briefly talk about the CAF dimensions and linguistic complexity specifically, and then look at different linguistic complexity indices as applied to the analysis of learner language, Russian specifically, through the kind of work that I have done so far. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes to discuss just these various ideas. So I know it's sort of, you may be thinking like, oh, why would she want to define second language for the crowd who is here today, right? But I do want to do it because I think it's important for us to remember when we're talking about learner language, when we're talking about heritage language, like what our definitions are. And I just wanted to remind everyone that when we are talking about second languages, we often define it in opposition to first language, right? And that's, I think, is a key idea when we try to sort of to separate or to understand the differences between second learners and heritage learners. So the idea for second language learners is that the crucial difference here is that this language is added to the linguistic repertoire of the speaker after the first language or languages have been acquired, have been sort of entrenched in the mind. With heritage language, regardless of the proficiency, it's a language that is spoken at home or otherwise readily available. So in that regard, HL is acquired on the basis of an interaction with naturalistic input versus something that we normally see in L2. Although I do think that even when we're talking about second languages, we often forget to differentiate naturalistic L2 learners versus instructed L2 learners. But I think more often than not, especially within the field of learner corpus research, we're dealing with instructed L2 learners. And in heritage, in the field of heritage language research, we're really dealing with learners or speakers who started learning their HL natural in a authentic environment of the home, and it's a naturalistic input which interacts with whatever linguistic mechanisms, sort of biologically endowed mechanisms that are at play in instances of child language acquisition, of first language acquisition. And I also want, please, everyone to notice the fact that Rothman is intentionally vague in his sort of theoretic assumptions here, you know, whether you're a generativist or an emergentist. The idea is that here's the linguistic input. These are your biologically endowed mechanisms that allow for first languages to evolve. And now another distinction that I do want to make here as well is that at least lately in the field, we are beginning to differentiate more specifically heritage language speakers and heritage language learners. And this is where the sort of the fields of L2 acquisition, especially instructed second language acquisition, and heritage language acquisition or instructed heritage language acquisition also bridge together a bit or come together a bit more, because we are now talking about the fact that among all of these heritage speakers in the wild, as Polinsky and Kagan called them, are also coming to our classrooms. And again, just because we tend to study our students, so most of the time the research and heritage language acquisition is done with heritage language learners who are intentionally relearning the heritage language. Right, now, a language corpus, normally, so when we're thinking about language corpus, a few assumptions and a few key conditions become very important. This understanding that a language corpus represents naturally occurring language. And this, as you know, becomes a bit of a thorny, not thorny, but, you know, something to think about and a point to think about when we are doing research with learner language. Even though I assume the classrooms to be absolutely authentic environments, you know, socially authentic environments, we still understand that in the classroom, sort of the language that is produced in the classroom is usually kind of more dialogically intertwined with the language that the instructor is providing, that these standard varieties that are sort of provided for the students. So we are kind of just a step removed from kind of getting at the, you know, at the very specific representation of whatever mental knowledge, the mental representation of the language that the learner speaker has. But that's what we deal with, right? So just wanted to mention that we always have this at the back of our mind when we're looking at the performance and, you know, the data that we collect in the classroom. Electronic form is, you know, not something that is terribly difficult, even though it takes forever and forever. But, you know, when you start looking at the written production that people do by hand, especially if you're interested in spelling and orthography, how to represent all of that in electronic form becomes a very, very interesting and important issue. And then the very big question, I think, in my mind, the idea of representation or representativeness. I think I have these slides here that I wanted to point out that just because of the fact that we don't have a huge amount of data that we collect from heritage language learners or heritage language speakers, and the fact that these groups are so incredibly diverse and varied, and the sort of the proficiency levels, the skills, what they know and what they don't know is so varied that it's, you know, that we need to be very careful about making claims and really saying like, oh, my corpus represents all heritage speakers of Russian. Never is the case, right? And nonetheless, if we try really, really hard and, you know, we consider all of these issues very careful and we do our best and our due diligence in accounting for all of these specifics. We create a really good learner language corpus, especially if we're talking about heritage language corpus. Such a corpus can help us with a lot of things, and it has been, well recorded that that corpora and corpus-based research helps identify patterns of language development, and through that, of course, it informs theory of language development. It can identify structures that are particularly difficult for language learners, and that is interesting both for the teachers of those languages, but also to, researchers and the theoreticians who sort of have been grappling with this idea that different structures, different syntactic or semantic structures in the same language may have different, or they're not all created equal, and they may pose different levels of difficulty in terms of acquisition. And of course, and I work a lot in the field of teaching, both the heritage and the HL2. So I hope that corpus-based research really helps inform pedagogical practices, make them more empirically based and better. And of course, people who do assessments are looking at our work very, very carefully, hoping that this can contribute to this wonderful field of semi-automated and automated language assessment. All right, so we're going to focus mostly on these first two through the research that I will review today. In addition to kind of talking about, or rather, this wonderful world of corpus-based research turned out to be a particularly fertile ground, I guess, for further development of the specific approach to the analysis of language, of learner language, which is known as CAF, or the three aspects of linguistic performance known as complexity, accuracy, and fluency. And specialists in second language acquisition have long advocated for describing language performance from these three perspectives. And, not just the researchers, honestly, the three aspects are intuitively make sense even to lay people, right? So even in lay discourses, we often describe people speaking fluently or haltingly, right, which is the opposite of fluently, I guess. We can describe someone's language as limited or very rich and eloquent. So we do sort of evaluate linguistic performance in these terms as well. These three concepts have been quite foundational for research in second language development, and various measures have been thought of, and these three aspects are operationalized in different ways. And accuracy and fluency have been studied for quite a while, and I think they're a lot more straightforward, while complexity is a bit more multidimensional and complex. Complexity is complex, which is no-brainer. So it's a complexity is a very interesting and sort of very multidimensional, very complex construct. But here specifically, and for my talk and in my work, I refer to linguistic complexity using this well-established definition as a range of lexical, morphological, syntactic, discoursal, phonological, if you will, forms that are available to language learners and the degree of sophistication of these forms. Linguistic complexity is measured through both global and specific metrics or indices, in an attempt to provide this objective measure of tracking language development. And we can track language development over time or across levels of proficiency, although despite the fact that this is normally a stated a stated purpose of a lot of research in linguistic complexity in L2. As a field, we haven't done a really good job in defining proficiency in a straightforward and very clear way. We have been very vague about defining proficiency, unfortunately, which is something that I think the field is, really recognizing and working to amend. Yes, so yes, as I mentioned, linguistic complexity indices have served as an important measure in L2 development, but it hasn't so far been applied to the study of heritage language. And most importantly, even though previous research, I think I had this clever animation here. Yes, previous research demonstrates that various linguistic complexity indices correlate with both quality of language performance, with the time, the amount of time someone spends learning a language. It can correlate with proficiency levels. There is this but here. And the but is the research gaps that we notice in the field. First, the absolute majority of the available research is conducted on L2 English, right, with the Lotte languages lagging behind, considerably less commonly taught languages and less commonly researched languages are rarely represented in linguistic research. And this is why I'm especially very excited about, Portuguese being added to the collection of corpora, heritage and L2 corpora, because we do have something or a lot to contribute, I think. And here's, oopsie, my apologies. Yes, so here's the critique that I already mentioned. There is a huge lack in consistency in defining proficiency. And that proficiency is assumed in different ways. It's assumed as a level of study, or it can be defined through a curricular level. Sometimes people define it through a holistic score. And more rarely, but I think now more and more systematically, surfer levels and actful levels are becoming more in vogue, which I think is a good idea. I hope to show you why. So this is what I hope to do with my particular research, is again, add to the volume of L2 and HL corpus-based research. And I do hope it's not just for the field of Russian, right? So the more work we do with Russian and other languages, the more I think we can encourage our colleagues who work with less commonly taught languages to add corpus research to their repertoire. So we're also looking at just really evaluating whether that instrumentarium, that sort of repertoire of resources and methods and concepts that the field of corpus-based research and CAF research has created, whether this is something that is useful for the study of heritage languages, whether it's useful for the study of Russian, either as an L2 or as a heritage language. And yes, advocate for more transparent definitions and operationalizations of language proficiency in general. So, so far we have contributed, I guess, to these questions through a couple of studies that that came out. I've been working on these studies for quite a number of years, but they all came out just recently. And I really hope that we also will push out a couple more studies that are in the works. So that's a paper that looked at writing development as well as proficiency gains using the indices of both lexical and syntactic complexity. And I will focus on just as I review my data, I will just focus on lexical complexity for the sake of time. Sort of, this is just an illustration of how things work generally. So we used the Middlebury Russian corpus of learner language, and this is straightforward L2 corpus. We collected data through this immersion program that runs at Middlebury. This is where I will be collecting more data this summer. So this is an 8-week immersion program. We have, this is the beauty of it, we have beginner to advanced learners, 7 levels in the programmatic curriculum. All students take entrance and exit oral and written exams, and all of these exams are conducted using the guidelines of the Actful Proficiency guidelines, which map onto Surfer really well. So we basically have, so we collect data that is already evaluated for proficiency by external and well-trained evaluators. So just, you know, beautiful data not to collect. So it's available to us and to anyone who is interested in gaining access to this data. So we basically collected all the data, and we wanted to find out which automatically instructed indices of lexical and syntactic complexity will correlate with both development over time, because we have the sort of the beginning and the end, the 8 weeks. We have proficiency gains because we measure proficiency using Actful guidelines at the beginning and at the end of the program. And we also have the 7 programmatic curriculum levels. So people are also placed into separate levels based on internal criteria, basically based on a test, which is mostly grammar, like a grammatical test. So we're just looking at written data right now, although we are working on also transcribing oral data. Hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll be able to compare writing and speaking as well. So this is what we thought was really cool about this study. Because that data is, just the nature of this data allowed us to compare the use of the same indices with whether these indices tell us anything about sort of the programmatic level, right? Do they actually help differentiate programmatic levels? Do they help differentiate proficiency levels? And can we just sort of see the development over time, just 8 weeks? What does it do to our learners? So hence the research questions. So that's the period of immersive instruction. These are a relationship between curricular levels and complexity indices, and relationships, my apologies, relationships between lexical indices and basically the rate of scores, but we are looking at proficiency levels, right? So this is the data. It is, so the paper came out last year. So currently the corpus is 3 times as large, and we are working to sort of modify the study to show even better picture. But even with the number of speakers, we're still able to see quite robust statistical patterns. All the essays were handwritten. We had to type them up. I have research assistants. Thankfully, they're all standardized for spelling because we need to automatically parse the data. But it's also need to keep the misspellings in the form of tags. We then standardize files, and we use UDPipe tagger for parsing and annotation. And then, of course, we have a number of customized Python scripts to do the extraction of data. For lexical complexity specifically, we looked at this fairly lengthy list of indices, and we couldn't basically include all of them into the statistical analysis because the data, or the collection, the data set is still relatively small. But this summer we're actually working on finalizing the scripts for absolutely all of these indices, And we're also rerunning all of these scripts on a larger, much larger database. So we might, come back, or at least maybe next year in Amherst, we can talk about how all of these work and what they show. Another interesting thing is that, all right, so we looked at, so for the analysis, we basically just focused on average word length, type token ratio. Every time I try to point at something, my slides skip. I apologize for that. So we looked at type token ratio, both by token and by lemma. Russian is a morphologically rich language, so we thought there may be an important difference there. And we were also looking at the counts of sophisticated words. Something that came out of this work specifically is that we realized that this highly used measure of sophistication is actually super difficult to operationalize. So we in this research we used this word list developed by Yanda et al. It's sort of based on frequencies and lists of words collected through all kinds of different textbooks and the lexical minimum list. So it's a combination of different ways of assessing sophistication. But then when we started looking at sort of how different lists that are available compare to one another, we realized that they actually, they overlap poorly, and none of them cover significantly more than 50% of words that are actually used by the learners. So I have a lot of questions for our colleagues who do that kind of research in English. So it's either that English L2 lists are so much more better, or there's something going on methodologically that people don't quite talk about. So we're currently, looking into this issue, comparing all the available frequency lists and also lexical minimum lists. And this is, hopefully this will give us something interesting to talk about in the future. So when we're looking at these metrics, what we see is that, and just even looking descriptively and at the confidence interval means, we see that all of these indices provide us with an understanding that they all change over time, right? So even when we mush all the different levels together, as a group, our learners of Russian develop over the 8-week period. And all of these indices actually or reliably track with the time period. So, and again, going back to this question of how well the sophistication lists work, we realized that the lower, so the predictions for lower level words, right? Words that belong to SERFA level 1, A1, they become an interesting factor or predictor, but everything else is just kind of not working, right? So if we're using or attempting to use words from the second proficiency level and above, that's not telling us anything in terms of development, which is interesting, really. But yet, we're still, sort of happy to even look at the first band and see that, it does in fact provide this inverse correlation with the levels, meaning the fewer A1 words someone uses, kind of the better their language is, right? Like if we think about this in terms of quality. So the development means that students start learning more words that are not that do not belong to this lower level band. And the mean word length, prose, MTLD word, and that's the TTR, that's the specific type of TTR, type token ratio, that we used to measure type token ratio. So both by token and by lemma, the variability of lexical items goes up, right? And that happens. So this is still research question 1. So this is over time, right? Over time, all of these things increase, and that one decreases. When we're looking at the correlations using the correlational matrices, the correlations between lexical indices and curricular levels, remember the 7 levels that are determined on the basis of some grammar tests? These all actually matter. So we're, separating students into levels based on grammatical tests, but all the lexical indices actually matter. They all matter. They all correlate with these curricular levels really well. And these the same, I think it's, oh, here that we are. So I should have said research question 2 and research question 3, because I do have correlations for proficiency here as well. So if we correlate with proficiency, that sort of actful-based evaluation of whether this person belongs to intermediate or intermediate high or advanced low level of proficiency, these global assessments also correlate with our lexical indices. So in the end, what we're sort of doing or saying is that even these 4 straightforward sort of base level lexical indices change with time spent in the program. They correlate with programmatic levels, and they correlate with assessment ratings. In a way, someone can say, like, so what? But, really, this is a small step towards saying that, yes, we can use these automated measures to even predict levels, right? Or to help someone improve a placement protocol. And yes, we can say that there's these very objective measures, right? An assessment is often, the field of assessment and different assessment tools are often critiqued for being too subjective. So we can find these very specific and very objective measures of development, of proficiency, of ability and quality. Even though we, of course, would like to expand the repertoire of these. For example, by using syntactic complexity measures. And this is where we move into the study of heritage learners of Russian. Can these indices also be applied to the study or the assessment of heritage languages? And that's a big question, because ACTFL guidelines and ACTFL protocol has been critiqued for being unsuitable for heritage learners, right? So a lot of people say, no, we can't use these tests that were developed for proficiency evaluation of L2 speakers to sort of to evaluate the level of proficiency of heritage learners. It may have a lot of grounds for being true, but other objective measures of proficiency, for example, lexical and syntactic complexity indices. And we also wanted to look a bit more specifically at the difference between the global and specific indices of linguistic complexity. I will give you an example of the global versus specific indices a bit later. So it's a different, obviously, this is a different set of data. This is another learner corpus that I have been working on, that I've been collecting, or rather attempting to, whip into shape in the past few years. So this is This is a corpus that was collected through essay contest. So it includes data both from L2 and the HL learners of Russian, but for this particular study, we only used the HL subset. And the HL subcorpus has that many texts, not too many. I wish we could have more, but that's what we have currently. And all of these essays, again, were evaluated by a certified W2 rater, and they were assigned an actual proficiency scale grade or assessment. So they all have this level: intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high, advanced low, etc., etc. And so, that was done by someone who has no stake in the research project. So interestingly enough, and this is something that is interesting for us as scholars of heritage language, if your heritage learner can write, even if they are not super proficient writers, if they make a lot of spelling mistakes, etc., they're not fluent writers, but if they can write, they will receive at least intermediate mid, which is about B2 on SOFR. So they're immediately kind of like, if they have any sort of oral C and you teach them to write things down, they are most likely to be intermediate, mid, intermediate, high level learners. The sad story is that those, at least American students who are attempting to learn Russian as an L2, rarely reach intermediate high in 3 years of formal intensive study of Russian at a college level. So heritage learners rule, honestly. We do have that many advanced speakers and even some superior level speakers. These are, really high level learners of Russian as a heritage language. So these are all the complexity indices that we looked at. We looked at some length-based measures as simple as mean sentence length. Here we also implemented a kind of methodologically new idea for measuring phrasal complexity. We basically counted nesting depth. We counted how many embedded clauses are in each phrase, and basically in each sentence. And we looked at basically the maximum nesting length, and just to see whether something like a shallow, like we can assign this idea of a shallow depth, shallow syntactic depth. So we looked at number of phrases with this nesting depth between 1 and 3 embedded phrases. And then global indices. So coordination and subordination has been studied in this type of research forever. And just the number of coordination and number of subordination will be counted something like global indices, right? So it's more global than the very specific types of syntactic structures. But in some previous research that we did with heritage language learners, we noticed that these just sort of global measures may or may not work really well. So in addition to just kind of combining, aggregating all subordinate structures together, we actually looked at different types of subordinate structures separately. And what we found indeed was, and this is also this descriptive stats. I know it's a lot of numbers. I apologize for that. But what I wanted to point out is that, yes, mean sentence length, it's like our, trusted measure, works beautifully. It differentiates even on descriptive stats. You can see that these differences probably means something, right? The mean nesting depth also, looks kind of looks promising. Everything else is just like maybe. But if we look at sort of subordinate clauses as an aggregate, not much is there. So there are 30, 31, and 31 across across levels. So it doesn't seem that as a global measure, the number or the proportion of subordinate clauses mean anything. However, if we look at different specific types, they start giving us some idea of differences across levels. And so kind of getting ahead of myself, I want to say that it's really important for us to look at specific structures as well as more congregate measures. This is just a different representation of what we see across levels. And, you know, graphically speaking, again, we see the picture for different types of clauses being very different, right? So when we look at the statistics, and here we just did a relatively simple ANOVA test, we see that, again, the global measures don't matter unless, of course, you consider the nesting depth a global measure, and it is, right? Because it's just looking at the measure of how many embeddings are there. That works really well, and the specific types of clauses well, but the congregate global measures don't work really well. So now I'm running out of time. I just wanted to very, very briefly mention that we also looked at the at this question whether these lexical complexity indices can actually differentiate between the background, language learning background. So we did. We were able to build a predictive model for predicting both levels and language learning background, heritage and non-heritage, and it works relatively well. We do need a lot more data. It's, you know, just a kind of a first poke at the question, but it appears that we can not only use lexical and syntactic complexity measures to correlate them with growth over time, with placements in curricular levels, with proficiency levels, but we can even see correlations between some of these measures and language learning background, which I think has enormous implications both for pedagogy, for assessment, and for linguistic theory. So even this limited set of indices could predict level and background with moderate degrees of certainty. And of course, that made us very, very happy. So these are the general conclusions that I just went through. I want to thank you all very much for listening, and I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. Thank you. Oh, and these are my beautiful colleagues who make all of this possible.